Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, everybody. Very warm welcome to this TMForum webinar, how to leverage data analytics across the entire CSP organization. So this webinar is based on a report which we are publishing today. So it'll be up on the Inform website later today, inform.tmforum.org. Before we can actually just to let you know, the slides that I'll be presenting will be circulated. So we'll send you a link to the slides within the next 24 hours, so you don't need to worry about taking screenshots or scribbling down notes. In terms of the format of the next hour, I have about 15, 18 slides to go through. We have a couple of live poll questions with the slides. And then we'll do a Q&A with you at the end. If you have any questions as I'm speaking or as I'm talking with our distinguished guests, then please use the Q&A button on your console to write up a question, and we'll address that at the end. So a very warm welcome, as I've mentioned, to our two Gregs. So I think, as most of you know, we have sponsors for our research, and I'm delighted to have Conviva's and Netscout support for partnering with us on this piece of research. Greg Armstrong. Greg is Chief Marketing Strategy Officer at Conviva. Now, Greg is in Sydney, so he's picture the scene. Greg is at his desk in his pajamas with his mug of cocoa. So the sooner that we finish, the better for Greg. So Greg, thank you so much for extending your evening. I hope it's been worth you a while.
Thank you, Matt. I think for me, it's just a very early morning.
We'll call it early morning, okay. And then we have, going the other direction, we have Greg Mayo. Greg is Chief Architect in the Service Provider CTO Office at Netscout. And Greg, I believe that you're in Boston, so I guess you're, second cup of coffee of the day or cup of tea of the day, I guess, for you. So a fairly early one for you.
No, it's good. All good.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Greg. So I'll be pulling in Greg for the poll questions and the Q&A at the end. So let's dive straight into the presentation. So a lot of the research that we do is focused on the operator business, and we do a lot of industry surveys. So for this piece of research, we surveyed about 60 CSPs globally. We've got over 100 responses, and the people we surveyed are either people who worked in the data science team, or they worked in the IT team, but were major users and consumers of data in the business. So these are people who very much create and use data within an organization, so that they have vested interests, I think, in terms of discussing data. So a number of these slides use the survey responses. We conducted the survey in the period October-November. So our opening gambit in terms of the question was, how effectively is your organization using data today? And we asked respondents to score their organization between 1 and 100. So if you score your organization at 50, it means that you're okay, you're sort of par for the course. If you score your organization at 25, clearly you think that you're using data pretty ineffectively. If you score at 75, it shows you think you're scoring your organization quite effectively. So just walking you through this graphic here. So this is saying that 19% of our respondents score their organization at less than 30, 24.5% between 30 and 50, 34% between 50 and 70, and 22.5% over 70. So the median there is just over 50 per 50. So I don't know how to view that really. I mean, you could see that as being glass half full or glass half empty. However, what I think is important is to compare how organizations feel they're using data with how important they believe data is. And when we ask the question, how important is it for your organization to successfully use data across your organization, 90% said it was essential. and 9% said it was very important. So just 1%, so I think just one respondent said it was important but not hugely important. So there's clearly a gap between how organizations are using data today and how they need to use it because they think it's essential for their business. And that very much, I think, sets a context for the discussion we're going to be having over the next 45 minutes. So when you ask them which data is most valuable, I think the two sets of data I guess that come to mind most are data about customer preferences and needs, and data about the network. And these scored first and second. I think it's pretty close in terms of whether it was customer data more important or network data more important. The other data sets, I think they're all things being quite important. So one about brand and reputation. So that could be as simple as an NPS score. I think some operators might have more sort of richer data sources that measure brand and reputation. Employee data, so it could be employee satisfaction. I know that TMForum runs some digital maturity assessments where we encourage organizations to survey large pools of employees about how mature they think their organizations are. So we think that's particularly important. Supply chain data, so that's about the companies that are supplying you with your technology and solutions. And the last one here, which I do want to spend a minute on, which is data from social media. And I'm not sure if people misinterpreted this question, but we actually asked another question about the usage of social media data. And I found it most surprising that ranked so low. So again, I don't know whether people understood the question or not, but what we're referring to here is what your customers are saying about you on social media. And whatever way we choose to cut the question and the answer, it certainly appears that that data is not being captured and leveraged and used as much as it could be. Maybe one of the challenges there is the fact that a lot of that data tends to be unstructured, and trying to integrate unstructured data into structured data can be quite challenging. But that certainly was one of my findings, which is that the industry really hasn't got as far as it should have got in terms of using that social media data either reactively or ideally proactively. So that was interesting. So coming on to why we think data isn't being leveraged as well as it could across the organization. And the key to this piece of research is it's the across the organization part. So it's how to leverage data across the organization. And it's our observation that within different departmental silos, there will be a data strategy. There may well be a data technology strategy, which is particular to that department or organization, be it IT or network, ideally across IT and network, but I don't think the integration of those two functions has come as far as we would have thought it had done. Within the marketing function, within the lines of business, so within enterprise, within consumer, within maybe the IT business, within wholesale. And so when you look at the usage of data and data strategies within those silos, I think those departments would say that they're using that data reasonably effectively. So the network function is using data to make the network function better. I think they would argue that case. But the real issue and the real missed opportunity, we believe, is using data across the organization. So taking data from one of these silos and applying it into another silo. And I do think this touches on a far broader issue around transformation generally, and the fact that telcos organizations are large, heavy, they're pretty hierarchical organizations. They find it very hard to collaborate across those functions. And interestingly, I think some of the recent developments around governance and issues such as GDPR has actually reinforced that siloization. So sometimes I think even if there is a degree of willingness or openness from one silo to allow someone from another function to access data, often I think concerns about the abuse of that or the lack of security around that data can get in the way. So we certainly see this as being central to the issue, and this is one of our main reasons for the research project. Actually, I should have mentioned at the start of this presentation that what were the triggers that made us produce this piece of research, and I think there are two main drivers for it. So the first driver was that across TMForum, all of the collaborative initiatives that we're pursuing are wholly dependent upon getting access to data across the organization. And we almost take it as a given that that data will become available across the organization, but we're hearing all too often that that is not the case. So I felt we should dig into this a bit deeper. So that was the number one, I think, inspiration. I think the second one was that we are now talking about AI on a fairly regular basis, and people often talk about the future of this industry and the future potential being based on 5G and AI. And I think, as we all know, that AI use cases simply will not fly without access to the right data at the right time in the right place. So I think what's actually happening now is that the interest in deploying AI, and I think there is interest from senior levels of the organization in using AI, is actually forcing operators to look at their data strategies, because if they don't get that right, then you simply cannot start to deploy AI effectively. So there are the two starting points for the research. Okay, I think now we're going to move on to our first poll question. So if you're a member of the audience, then please take note, however later in the day it is, please, and would like to get your feedback, please. So we have a question. What is the biggest single barrier to leveraging data within your organization / within CSPs? So we'd like you to talk about CSPs, regardless of whether you are a vendor or whether you are an operator. So I'm going to give you 30 seconds to choose which one you think is the biggest single barrier, and then myself and the two Gregs will we'll have a discussion about what the answers are. So please get voting now. I'll give you another 10 seconds. Okay, so I think it's always a degree of trepidation that I push the arrow on to see what sort of replies we're getting. So an interesting one, guys. So we had a discussion before we started around what we thought would come up. I'm going to ask Greg Armstrong first, because I'm worried that you might be falling asleep there in Sydney. So, as you know, I think I said I'll ask Greg Mayo first. So, Greg Armstrong, at least I've got your attention, Greg. But Greg Mayo first. Do you find those answers at all surprising? What you might expect? I mean, it's pretty divided, isn't it? I think.
I don't find it surprising, and that's very much what we see. We've seen. There's so many different kinds of data sources, and many times people will try to get whatever one is the most available, whether it's the most effective. And we put them into data lakes, sometimes multiple data lakes, like you've seen in those silos. I've seen different teams with different data lakes. And then harmonizing that data becomes very, very difficult. So I totally agree with this, and this is what I see in my customers as well. And this is one of the things we're trying to solve and help with.
Yeah. Thank you, Greg. And Greg Armstrong, anything to add?
Look, we talked about this beforehand, and I expected it to be sort of across these areas, and I think it just goes to show how complex this issue is, because these three main ones, culture, data governance, lack of a single data model, they're not simple challenges to resolve. And
it really is sitting across technology issues and cultural people issues. So the problem sits everywhere, doesn't it? And maybe we can understand now why we haven't got as far as we we would like to have done because it's complicated and difficult.
And because, there's drivers for people to achieve outcomes. And, this is big infrastructure building stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, great. So I think we'll be picking up some of these themes later on, but thank you, audience, for your answers. Okay, so that's just the poll question. So, as I mentioned before, the two key sources of data I think that we're talking about here are data about the network and data about data coming from the network and data coming from customers. I think there's a third one, which is data from IoT, which we're not really covering in this session. I think maybe it's subject of a future session, but generally I think it's as I say, it's customer, network, and then IoT. So we asked our respondents in the survey the question, how successful are you in leveraging data to improve the network? And I think when you look at that first black box there, 2 out of 3 respondents believe they're successfully collecting and processing network data to identify real network problems. And I think it's probably something that that operators have been doing for a long time. We talk a lot about analytics, big data now, but actually data hasn't only existed in the last 10 years. Before we talked about BI, and that function of collecting data from the network to improve the network is something which is core and inherent to, I think, the telco business. So not particularly surprising that most of you think that that operators are leveraging data from the network pretty successfully. I think the next two answers are quite interesting. So actually, if we take the third one first, so we're using analytics to detect network anomalies in near real time. So I think if I hadn't have put near real time here, I think the black would probably have been, up to sort of 60-70%. I think the real time might have held people back. But nevertheless, I think there are people thinking that a reasonable success in using analytics to detect anomalies. Whether or not that's being used for self-healing, I think, is a bigger issue. And clearly, a lot of you think that we have some progress to make in terms of using that data to heal the network. And then the fourth question is one a little bit different, which is asking about operators' dependency upon vendors for that data. And I think that's quite an important point when we come to some of the technology issues and issues around sort of a single data model. And I think one of the reasons why we are today is because operators, you do use all different technology suppliers, and a lot of them will look at and view data differently, and you're trying to sort of build a single picture across those different approaches. So when we think about use cases around the network, so that the left-hand side is those use cases which are relatively well tried and tested. And we mentioned prioritizing alarms, predicting when an alarm might occur, predicting when maintenance is needed, introducing real time. Well, I think it's probably again we're in stage of transitioning towards real time now, as with self-healing as well. Again, I don't talk too much about security risks in the network, but I think particularly when we think about moving towards cloud native, I'm increasingly hearing concerns about security. So I think that's going to become an increasing issue for, I think, operators, which is using data to identify and address security risks. The ones on the right are sort of new ways in which we think operators can and should be seeking to better leverage network data. So this one, network planning and investment, I'm sure that most CSPs do use data for network planning and investment, but I think the key point here is that some of those network planning and investment and CapEx cycles are getting shorter and shorter. And if you're looking at 1-year CapEx cycles, then you have enough time. But if you're looking at quarterly CapEx cycles, which many operators are doing now, that ability to effectively use data to help predict your requirements for investment planning are absolutely essential. And I certainly see quite a few technology suppliers seeing opportunity here to help operators to make that process more efficient as well. Agile procurement. So for those of you who follow some of the research activities at TMForum, we've done a lot of work around changing processes around procurement and moving towards agile procurement. The richer the granularity of data you have, the easier it will be to move towards agile procurement and to work with your finance teams to get them on side to having a more flexible procurement model. Adopting a customer-centric view of the network. So, if you were to ask me the question, where is the biggest opportunity today across the organization, it is bridging that gap between network data and customer centricity. And I think that came through very clearly in our survey as well, that when we look at the CRM and network functions, there's a lot of potential there for making the CRM, for improving the CRM function through better access to network data. Then we have data monetization. Again, this presentation isn't dedicated to data monetization, but we've been talking about operators collecting network data, anonymizing network data, and reselling network data for some time now. I would say probably for 8 or 9 years. I think most operators would say that they have some sort of monetization strategy. We've seen some operators set up standalone businesses to resell data. Some of them do it from within their broader technology organization. There's one large operator that I spoke to a month or so ago said it had 100 customers that are selling data to. So the sorts of companies that might be interested in buying network data are organizations that need to see movements of people, typically in and around cities. So if you're in the retail business, the real estate business, if you're in the transportation business, you may well want to get access to that data. So my impression there is it's absolutely an opportunity. It might not be a hundreds of millions of dollar opportunity, but it could nevertheless be a highly profitable opportunity if it's given the chance to breathe, I would say. And then increasing partnerships and development. So, what I think we mean here is that when we look ahead to 5G, and this applies both to the consumer market and the B2B market, I think we all believe there's a potential for more partnerships and I can foresee a time when operators will be competing with each other for the best partnerships. So you'll need to be thinking about what is there that I can offer to my partner that makes me a more attractive proposition than my rival operator. And I would say data is going to be pretty high up the list. So the more data you can give your partners, the better chance you will have of securing profitable partnerships. So I think when we just look at that right-hand column, there's huge potential here, I think, for better leveraging network data across the organization. I saw someone. Did either of you want to come in, either Greg or Greg, if he on that particular point, or should we save it till the Q&A?
Yes, sorry, save it. Yeah, I was agreeing.
No, please, Greg, go ahead and say something if you want to.
No, it's all fine.
Okay, great, Greg. Okay, so this is asking the same question about how operators are leveraging data for CRM, and so I think generally, from a sort of a board level perspective, I think operators are very aware that if they want to become digital service providers, this ability to use data in customer relationships is absolutely essential. I think one of the biggest differentiators between a telecoms operator and a DSP is the fact that if you're a DSP, your relationship with the customer is digital, your touch points are all digital. Every time there's a touch point, you're generating data which you use to better understand your customer and then to provide the customer with what they want. So, so when we ask the question, how effectively as a CSP do we think you're using and leveraging data for customer experience, you can see that there's a lot less people saying that a lot less under 50% than over 50. A lot less under 50%. In fact, no one says over. In no case are there more than half of respondents saying that they agree that their operator is successfully leveraging data. So the first one, we're effectively using data to deliver more personalized services. Almost half the people, half respondents reckon that they are. We're effectively leveraging digital touch points to deliver personalized services. So about a third reckon they're successfully using digital touch points. We make good use of social media data to leverage customer life cycles. So we touched on this before, so just 10%. We mainly rely on vendors for front-end systems to leverage data, about a third, 1 in 3, and the last one, we're using network data in our front-end systems. So about 40% of operators are saying they are leveraging it. I guess just because you're leveraging doesn't mean that you're leveraging as effectively as you could do, which is the point I was trying to make before. So when I look at these numbers, I mean, what really occurs to me is that until you have a critical mass of customers who are largely using digital touch points in their customer relationships, it's going to be pretty difficult to successfully leverage data. And so we really have quite a long way to go in terms of moving towards digital-centric experiences. And the proportion of customers that, as I say, use those mobile apps, the portal, for most of their requirements is pretty small. I was with some people actually last night, some people who are T-Mobile users in the USA. T-Mobile seems to be pretty effective at getting customers to use their mobile app, and maybe that's because they make interesting offers, and so they're constantly looking at offering you something different via your mobile app. So I think that if you want to go beyond just having people using their mobile app to check how much data they have left or what their bill is, you need to offer them things via the mobile app. So you need to actually find a way of generating the data before you can start using that data. So if we start looking at some of the issues, I think, around why why it's so difficult to leverage data across the organization. So it'd be interesting actually to look at these answers. So this is very similar to the poll question I gave you, which is, what are the key barriers to leveraging data? So lack of a consistent data model, extremely important by just under half of respondents. We'll talk about that in a minute. Lack of urgency, which actually I didn't include, but I guess you could call that a cultural issue here. And it's something I'm actually going to ask the two Gregs in a minute, which is, is there really a lack of urgency about leveraging data? I mean, everything I read in, The Economist or Forbes tells me that every large enterprise is becoming data-driven. If every enterprise is becoming data-driven, then why is there a lack of urgency? I don't quite understand. So that I think is quite surprising. Lack of expertise. Again, we touched on this a bit later, but my sense is that operators employ large teams of data scientists, but often they're problem solving in terms of working out how to correctly take data out of a lake and regularize it and put it into a warehouse. They spend too much time doing that and not enough time being clever about how to actually use the data. Then we have dirty data and formatting issues, which I think can probably be grouped together, and I think a number of operators talk about this problem of problem of dirty data, and sometimes it's not dirty. It's challenging. It's just structured differently, and that's the issue rather than it being dirty. Well, I guess you could call it dirty. Then we have the one about data governance, which I think sometimes is a real barrier. Sometimes I think it's constructed as a barrier to get in the way of sharing data across the organization. So let's just dive into some of these. So data lakes. So when I started out on this research, I was expecting to find more people talking about data lakes being an issue that actually I did find. So I think organizations, telcos, do have an issue around, how many data lakes do they have? Can you have federated data lakes? Do you have one data lake for each of the main functions, or do you have a single data lake? I think the problem isn't in the data lake, is my sense. The problem is in how operators are using data lakes, and data lakes are becoming data swamps because the way in which operators are throwing data into the lake and then finding that when they need to get it back out there, it's difficult and challenging, and it takes time. And if it takes time, I think it's losing value. In terms of operators using data lakes, just under half are using data lakes. 17% say they're not. A further 36% say they are, but not for all their requirements. So I think in total you look at about 83%, so 4 out of 5 are using data lakes. Some seem to be using them for most of their requirements. Other are using them for part of their requirements. In terms of how effective they are, just over half operators saying they think it's a good approach for leveraging data. But as I say, there's 36% say it's difficult to extract data they need, and 8%, so 1 in 12 saying they don't think they represent the best approach moving forward, maybe moving forward into a 5G world. And I think when we start thinking about the edge, and the fact that I think we're going to be putting a lot more computing processing at the edge, I think that might challenge operators thinking around data lakes. So on the right here, I've just included a few of the comments we got from our respondents about how they found the use of data lakes. So yes, I think challenges are around real time, around too many lakes. But yeah, okay. So data or information models. So one of our starting points here was thinking, is it feasible to move towards a single or common data model? And I know my colleague in TMForum collaboration, Aaron Bozeman, he has a lot of operators and vendors saying to him they want to move towards a common data or common information model. But it seems as if that's going to be challenging, really challenging. 62 and 2 out of 3 respondents saying they're not using a single data model, and it'll be extremely difficult for them to move towards that model because they have lots of vendors working on different models. Just 1 in 4 say they're not using a single data model, but they can move towards it. So this is becoming a very important issue for some of the large national or regional operator groups, and I sense that they are increasingly looking to deploy a single data model. Again, one large European group I spoke to 3 or 4 weeks ago said that 70% of the data they would like to push onto a single data model is now on that single data model. So they seem to be making some reasonable progress, I should say. But I say, all the time that we have a lot of different suppliers, it's going to be challenging because it's been built up over a long, long period of time. So this slide here is really just a way of drawing attention to some of the cultural issues and leadership issues around data. Now, I've chosen to focus on Telefonica here for a couple of reasons. So one, because Telefonica is I think the only operator in the world that has a chief data officer. That's a gentleman sitting down in the comfy chair called Chema Alonso. and he's Chief Data Officer, and he sits on the main board of Telefonica. So it clearly has massive profile within the organization. And the company talks a lot about its initiatives around data. It talks about the fourth platform and building this sort of customer interface, this voice-based interface that will collect data from customers, and they'll use that to develop their business moving forward. They've also been proactive in terms of reselling data. Now, the quote on the right is a quote that from a letter to shareholders written by the chairman last week about the future of the company and the ambitions of the company to become a major player in transformation of society, in transformation of enterprises. And I picked this because clearly this is telling me, it's telling us that Telefonica knows that it needs to change, it knows it needs to embrace data and data capabilities. However, the point I'm trying to make here is that often the barriers to using data efficiently and becoming a digital organization is actually around operational and cultural issues. And my sense here, and I might be completely wrong, and my apologies if I am, is that Chairman Alonso probably doesn't have a huge amount of operational responsibility across the organization for making sure that the right governance is in place to ensure that data flows properly across the organization. He's been very involved, and in fact, he's set up this fourth platform. He's involved in data monetization. But often I think the key to actually addressing this, leveraging data across the organization, is governance and culture and organization. So it's more than just the job of a chief data officer. It's something that needs to be imposed throughout the whole organization and to gain a higher profile. So I'm not just picking on Telefonica. Telefonica's done more than most operators, I would say. But I think I'm just using it as a reason to talk about the operational strategy versus the high-profile, maybe to monetization strategies, for example. This slide actually takes two separate questions around organizational structures and skills. And we did ask the question, how important is it to have internal expertise? And three-quarters of you think you do need to have internal expertise. And as I mentioned before, it seems as if there are large and burgeoning data science teams, but as I say, my question back to you all is, are they mainly involved in cleaning up data or how to properly leverage data across the organization? And my fear is that they're more involved in the former rather than the latter. One comment was made to me was actually you shouldn't really need to have a data science function. You should just have individuals who are able to take data and apply it in a business context, so using data insights just to make the business more efficient rather than having a team which is involved in cleansing and preparing data. The second chart here is around how you structure your data organization. And I think most operators have some sort of central function, but how much of the data science team sits within that central function? And I think there's a risk that if you build a standalone data organization, you might just be creating another pillar, another silo that gets in the way. And so I think clearly from these responses, you can see that 81% of respondents believe that there should be a pretty small centralized team, or maybe an even more flexible team than that goes around the organization applying resources as and when is needed. But I think the key to this organization is ensuring that it imposes rules and it takes an enablement function across the organization rather than it just being an operational team that slows things down. So I did ask a question about Edge, so here we have our second question, which is, how will Edge impact how your CSPs collect, store, and reuse data? So the first two is saying that it will have a profound impact. The first choice is saying it's having a profound impact and you're already getting ready for that. The second one is saying will have a profound impact, but you're not but maybe it's too early to work out how to approach it. The third option is it will have some impact, but it won't change things fundamentally. And the fourth option is it's not really going to change your approach very much. So maybe I can give you just 20 seconds, and then I'll ask the two Gregs to comment. So if you can vote now, please. Over 10 seconds. Okay, so let's take a look. So Greg Mayo, any thoughts there? We have, yeah. Well, I hope we have a decent number of responses here, but it seems as if, yeah, I don't know. What are your thoughts, Greg, in terms of where we are in terms of thinking about data at the edge and leveraging that? Is it going to change everything?
I think it does. I think if you look at the last 10 years and how this space has been run and transformed, these previous slides show like the recognition of the need, but I think that the companies have been able to survive and make money and do okay. As you go to the edge, the disruption that 5G, virtualization, and IoT is going to bring is massive. And this, the things we're talking about today is no longer a nice to have; it's a must to have. And if you don't have it, you will get beat by your competitors. Really.
Yeah. Okay. Anything to add, Greg Armstrong, or should we move on?
Well, look, the only thing from my perspective is, I guess maybe it's just what does the edge really mean?
I think it's a fair question. Yeah. And I'm in all sorts of conferences where there's basically no sense. Well, I think we have two paradigms. I think we have an edge computing paradigm from the applications guys, the hyperscalers. Then we have edge computing from an infrastructure perspective from the telcos. And the question is where they may or may not meet, I think. Okay, so let's move on. So will data move to the edge? So in answer to that question, a lot of you seem to not be sure precisely how it's going to change what you do. I think there's acceptance that you will move to the edge, but working out exactly how to change your approach, I think, is maybe too early. So this is my last slide. So this is just a few of our thoughts as to how operators can become more successful in leveraging data. So number one, I think you need a vision. I think, we talk about data-driven organizations. Do you have a vision for how data could help you achieve your ambitions, your visions? And I think if you don't have that vision, it's actually quite difficult to know where to prioritize. So one of the things I like about the way people are looking at AI is it's very much use case centric. So I think use case is a part of that vision, but I think you need to have a vision that even sits above that, because I think everyone would agree that telco is incredibly rich in terms of data, but I haven't seen many operators articulate exactly how that makes you different or better. Number two, redefine governance as an enabler for leveraging analytics. So, it's my observation that governance seems to be more of a barrier than an enabler for better analytics flowing across the organization. If you use governance properly to ensure that the right rules are in place that ensure people respect the importance of data and consistency for how to use data, how to manage data across the organization, it can become a real driver, I think, for your business. Number three, and this is one I've actually pitched this to people and they said, what have you got this one down for? But I'll talk you through it. So ask your vendors how they would recommend you transition to a common data model. So what always comes back to me, people saying, well, the challenge is that every one of the vendors is going to have a different view because they have their own approaches and their own data models. Well, ask them. Ask vendors what they would do in your shoes. You never know. One of your vendors might see this as being an opportunity for them to carve out a new role. So use them to get their feedback. They might have ideas. Don't allow central data team to become another silo. I've talked about that already. I think it's very, very important. Our research suggests that there are some large data teams emerging. I very much hope they are hoping to sort of become invisible or at least to become enablers to the business. Build a quarterly and annual roadmap reporting your progress. So if you have a vision for what you want to be, break that vision down into annual and quarterly targets and make sure that across the organization it gets this high profile. And I think the conversation the two Gregs and I will have in a minute is about how much of a priority is this for the telco. And I think from a board level, it has to become a priority that gets talked about, communicated both internally to staff and maybe even externally to stakeholders in terms of how much progress you're making with this journey towards leveraging data. So when we think about 5G and edge, I don't hear data being talked about as being integral or central to 5G and edge. Maybe the assumption is that it is, but actually maybe we need to be more explicit than that, because if you don't leverage that data in your 5G and edge, if you're competing with the hyperscale guys, you will need to use data if you're going to be delivering new value to your customers. And then lastly, engage with public cloud vendors. And I think we've seen recently AT&T, Microsoft, large deal. I think that's going to be around edge. We've seen last week, I think AWS announced it's working with a number of operators around edge computing. So I think the relationship between public cloud companies and telcos is probably one of the biggest, the single most important topics of our day. I think when it comes to this data around discussion, data and leveraging data, these guys know how to do it, and you may well need to work with them in order to make sure that you make best use of your assets. So that was my last slide. Oh, this is just for those of you who have business in the Middle East or who would like to grow your business in the Middle East. We have an event in Dubai in January, so if you want to attend that, then we'd love to have you there. I'm now going to move over to Q&A with Greg and Greg. So I've got a couple of prepared questions here. You, the audience, if you have any more questions, then please drop them in now and we'll address them. So I'm actually going to ask the two Gregs a question that we spoke about before we came on air, which was, I said that companies talk about being data-driven organizations, and yet it's my observation, I think it's the two Gregs' observation too, that there's not enough priority being given to how you leverage data across the organization. Why is that? Why is there a lack of urgency? And so my question to them is it just that there's a lack of understanding of the issue, or is it just not a priority, or is it both? So Greg Mayo, maybe I could ask you first.
I think it's a little bit of both. I think, again, if you look at, let's say the past 10 years, it was always who's got the fastest, who's got the most reliable, and you could compete with each other on those things. You watch the commercials, you watch, okay, we get the most coverage. That's now expected. Everybody's got a fast network. Everybody's got a pretty reliable network. The differentiators that have to take place between the different carriers now is going to have to take place from a different angle. And I think it comes from that using the data as the gold mine that they have at their fingertips that they didn't have to use before, that I think they do need to use now to really differentiate themselves in the marketplace. And it just necessitates the need for a good, clean, common data model that is effective, right? All edge computing really does is change how we build the data model. It doesn't really change the need for it or not. It just changes how does, like companies like myself, build it. But in the end, it just plays with the core, the edge, everything together that I see.
Okay. No, thanks, Greg. And Greg Armstrong, I hope you're still with us, Greg.
Yeah, I'm still here.
Great.
Hey, look, I just think it comes down to it being complex and still relatively new, in the sense that at the end of the day, if you think about how networks operators go about building networks, they've been doing this. There's many years, decades of practice and approach, and obviously that's evolved over time, but it's evolved with learnings. Here you've got a situation where it's much newer, And it was interesting when you were going through the results of the surveys and also talking about how you could see that AI, so the drive for AI was sort of helping to drive this requirement to get data used across the organization, because we certainly see that. I mean, that's where we're starting to see network data being pulled together with CRM and custom data. Yeah. So it was really interesting when you said that. And, you know, like it's one of those things where, you know, you think about it, you've got to make sure that you've got, there's got to be a coherent strategy. So someone's got to stand up and drive a strategy, and it's got to come from the top. But this takes so much energy. If you don't have like a visionary evangelist, someone to drive it.
Yes.
You know, and then you've got to get some wins.
Exactly. And so this issue around data model, information model, do either of you have any thoughts on how operators can address it? Is it something that operators can address individually, or is this an industry initiative? Do you see anyone making good progress in this? Greg Mayo?
I think it has been ad hoc. You know, obviously there's forums where they'll collaborate, but I do think because it's a differentiator, people are going to want to be first and kind of exceed in this area. So I think the operators will tend to take it more on their own in those respects. And I think, you know, again, the ones that are the visionary ones will recognize it has to be done. You know, if you wait 3-4 years from now as you're building out 5G and NFV, you're going to be late. And
have you seen any operators making good progress in this direction?
There's a handful, right? So there's the ones in the different regions, whether it's Australia, New Zealand, Asia, Europe. There's always one or two for sure. And those are the ones that have thought differently, you know, that have already tried to monetize. Like you said, I have some customers that are monetizing already. And
Greg Mayo, I forgot to ask you, for those people who aren't familiar with exactly where Netscout sits in this equation, can you give us a very brief summary of exactly what capabilities you're providing to telcos in this area of leveraging data?
Yeah, I mean, data is our only purpose for being in business. And we have been around for 30 years. Our founder is still the CEO, and we have built the company on trying to provide a common single data model from packets, being the one piece of information that everything communicates in a standard format. So we've built a company that takes that and is used for making sure the network's better, adding security, and then in the most recently 4 or 5 years, using it for other business cases beyond the network, because we see what every person is doing and what their experience is, where they are. Those companies can start to use that for different angles of business.
But presumably, when you're working with an operator, there'll be other vendors in different parts of the business who also have different ideas around having a common data model.
Well, they do, but what happens there is the other vendors tend to be the network equipment vendors whose general purpose in life is to move packets back and forth, and not to be the best provider of a single data model. In fact, they want to differentiate from their competitors. Ericsson wants to be better than Nokia. Nokia wants to be better than Huawei. So they don't have any real reason to collaborate. So for us, we're agnostic because they all have to speak on the wire. And so we kind of provide that agnostic data model for them.
Okay, thanks. And Greg Armstrong, sorry, I should ask you the first question before Greg as well. Can you tell us about Conviva and what capabilities you're providing in this space?
Yeah, sure. So we're specialists in CVM applications. So it's all about analytics-driven real-time marketing platforms to drive customer lifetime value, plus services, data science services, and managed services around that. It's interesting because partly one of our value propositions is the fact that we can help, bring together some disparate data sources and build it into a customer profile that can be used for CVM. It's sort of helping a journey along. And I mean, obviously we also have our own within our platform, our own data model, which we use for that purpose.
Right.
So
I mean, there's a question here, which is there a common data model that can be really useful for a number of use cases, which can be built by the CSPs? This can help the CSPs to get their data into data lake and check the level of readiness. So that's kind of taking the same question, isn't it? I mean, it's Greg Mayo, I'm assuming that, that question, you would say that you're one of the companies offering that common data model, I guess is what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, there's never going to be a single data model for everything, of course. Right? You're going to have to bring in and harmonize some different data models. What we're trying to do is provide at least a single one for data that we can see on the wire, which is similar to what the equipment vendors would bring in. Now, you're going to have other models that have to integrate, customer history data, things like that. And so I don't think you ever get to just one, but those players need to talk to each other. So at least we can harmonize so that when you do try to join them, they join properly and not with all the complexity and caveats that come with it right now. Yeah.
So, Greg Armstrong, maybe I can ask you the question. I mean, I ran through some of the use cases and opportunities. You guys at Conviva, do you see any specific opportunity to leverage data better, which you think is really out there and accessible today that you think operators should prioritize above any others?
Well, look, I think, what we see firstly is you've got to build out your customer profile. So the more you can do about enriching that profile, the better the information you've got for making decisions then about who to target, when to target, and what to offer them. And that's obviously the first thing people are doing. And you made the point, like if you start to apply AI and machine learning into CVM, you're making decisions about what offers to make. And distinguishing between offers that work for some customers and don't work for others. And if you don't have rich profile information to do that on, then you're not going to get effective models as outcomes.
Right.
And as I said, the other one that we're seeing in a couple of operators is where they've been able to start bringing in network data to actually build out an understanding of what experience an individual customer is actually seeing or receiving. And then being able to use that to leverage either triggering interventions or at least being used as part of decisioning about which offer to make.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. And then I guess the last question I have, and I'll stick with you, Greg Armstrong, and I'll go back to Greg Mayo. So, I talked a lot about the siloization of telcos. I mean, as a supplier of solutions, service, and capabilities, is that siloization an issue that you come up against?
To be honest, not really, because we're sort of in a silo ourselves in terms of supporting
the CVM silo.
The marketing side. Yeah. But we certainly, what tends to happen is that where there's an organizational mandate driven by the CEO, it becomes much easier to build out the profile information on the customer. As I was saying, starting to get leverage across those pillars that you had in one of those slides there, which it just resonated.
Yeah. Okay. Great. And Greg Mayo, maybe I can just give you the final word in terms of whether siloization is something that you come up against.
Yeah, we do for sure, and it's hard for us because of our lineage has been more on the network side, operations, making everything sure it's running properly, and like you showed, it's getting more mature. Having access to the people to tell them our message is a challenge for us because it's totally different teams, totally different groups. The sales guys don't have relationships. It makes it hard, but it's because the organizations are realizing this, it's becoming easier, but it's been a challenge for sure.
Really good point.
Yeah. Great. So we're on the hour now, so I think we'll wind up. So if you have any more questions for myself or either the Gregs, if you want to send them in to us, if you write the email, we'll send you tomorrow. I think, Greg, we have the two Gregs and my email address on the side that we'll send you, so I'm sure we'd love to hear from you if you have any further comments or thoughts. Thank you so much to the Gregs for giving up your time for today, and thank you for your participation in the audience. And if you get a chance, please have a read of the report and tell us what you think of it. So thank you so much, and we look forward to working with you again sometime. Speak soon. Thanks, Greg.
Thank you.
Cheers, everyone.
Thanks
Happy holidays.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.